It was a quiet afternoon in a small neighborhood, the kind of day where nothing out of the ordinary seemed likely to happen. On the corner of Maple Street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker sat on her porch, enjoying the gentle breeze and the sound of chirping birds. She had lived there for decades, watching seasons change and children grow. But what happened next was something she never could have expected. Out of nowhere, a little boy appeared at the edge of her yard, clutching a small shoebox tightly to his chest. His clothes were slightly rumpled, and there was a nervous look in his eyes. Mrs. Parker stood up, calling out to him, but the boy didn't say a word as he slowly made his way up the steps and placed the box at her feet. Curious, she carefully opened the lid, and what she saw inside made her heart race. Without wasting a moment, she reached for her phone and dialed 911, her hands trembling. What could possibly be in that shoebox to spark such a reaction? And who was this mysterious boy who had left it behind? Stay tuned as we unravel the heart-stopping story behind this unexpected encounter. Mrs. Parker's voice quivered as she spoke to the 911 operator, struggling to describe what she had just seen. Her usually steady hands couldn't stop shaking, and her mind raced with questions. Who was that boy? Why did he seem so scared? And most importantly, why would he leave something so alarming on her porch? As she waited for help to arrive, Mrs. Parker glanced back at the shoebox. She hadn't touched it again, afraid to disturb whatever it was that had shocked her so deeply. Her eyes darted toward the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy, but he was gone. The neighborhood, normally filled with the sounds of kids playing or neighbors chatting, felt eerily quiet. She thought about the boy's face, how young he looked, how his eyes carried something far beyond his years. Had he been running from someone? Or something? The shoebox, now sitting ominously on her porch, seemed to carry all the answers, and yet only deepened the mystery. The sound of distant sirens broke through the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Mrs. Parker stood frozen, torn between fear and curiosity. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights cutting through the calm afternoon. Mrs. Parker felt a wave of relief seeing the officers step onto her porch, but the tension in her chest remained. An officer, tall and serious-looking, approached her with a calm yet firm voice. "Ma'am, can you tell us exactly what happened?" he asked. Mrs. Parker tried her best to recount the strange series of events, the little boy, the shoebox, and the haunting look in his eyes. The officer crouched down to examine the box, putting on gloves before carefully lifting the lid. His expression didn't reveal much, but she noticed his brow furrow slightly as he leaned in closer. A second officer began asking about the boy. "Did he say anything to you? Did you recognize him?" Mrs. Parker shook her head, her mind racing. She realized she couldn't even describe his voice because he hadn't spoken a single word. "He looked about 7 or 8, she added softly. "But he seemed so scared." Meanwhile, the first officer stepped away, speaking into his radio in a low, urgent tone. Mrs. Parker strained to catch pieces of the conversation, but only heard words like unusual and investigation. Suddenly, one of the officers turned back to her, his face serious. "We'll need to ask you a few more questions inside." Mrs. Parker's heart sank. Whatever was in that shoebox, it was more than she'd imagined, and it was about to turn her quiet life upside down. Inside her cozy living room, Mrs. Parker sat nervously as the officers asked more questions. The shoebox, now sealed in a clear evidence bag, sat on the table between them like an unspoken secret. The sight of it made her stomach churn. She couldn't shake the image of the boy's trembling hands as he had handed it to her. Who was he? Where had he gone? And why did he choose her porch? One of the officers, a younger man with a kind face, tried to reassure her. "We're just piecing things together, ma'am. Do you remember seeing anything unusual in the neighborhood recently? Strangers? Any disturbances?" Mrs. Parker racked her brain but could only shake her head. Everything had been so ordinary, until now. Meanwhile, outside, more police cars had arrived, their lights casting eerie flashes across her front yard. Neighbors began to gather at a distance, whispering amongst themselves. From her window, Mrs. Parker caught sight of an officer searching the nearby bushes, his flashlight darting through the shadows. The younger officer's radio crackled, and a voice came through with urgency. Possible lead on the boy. Witness spotted him near the park, heading north. The officer exchanged a tense glance with his partner. They stood abruptly, thanking Mrs. Parker before heading out the door. She watched them leave, her heart pounding. The shoebox, now a symbol of all the unanswered questions, sat silently on her table. What could possibly connect the frightened child, the mysterious contents of the box, and the growing police presence? Mrs. Parker couldn't know it yet, but the answers would soon reveal something far darker than she ever imagined. Mrs. Parker sat in the now silent house, staring at the empty spot where the shoebox had been moments before. Her thoughts spiraled as the officer's hurried departure left her feeling more unsettled than ever. She tried to calm herself, but a nagging feeling crept into her chest. Something still wasn't right. As the minutes stretched on, she decided to make some tea, hoping it would soothe her nerves. Just as she reached the kitchen, a faint sound caught her attention. It was coming from the backyard, a soft rustling like someone moving through the bushes. Her pulse quickened. Peeking cautiously through the window, she could barely make out a figure crouched near her garden shed. Her breath caught as she realized it was the boy. He looked even more frightened now, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be chasing him. Without thinking, Mrs. Parker quietly opened her back door. "Hey," she called softly, trying not to startle him. "Are you okay?" The boy froze, his wide eyes meeting hers. For a moment, it seemed like he might run, but then he stepped closer, his small frame trembling. I didn't know where else to go," he whispered. Before Mrs. Parker could respond, she heard the crunch of gravel in her driveway. Turning quickly, she saw a black car idling at the curb, its windows tinted. The engine remained running, as if whoever was inside was watching and waiting. The sight sent a chill down her spine. She turned back to the boy, her voice urgent now. "Who's in that car? Are they looking for you?" The boy nodded slowly, his eyes welling with tears. "Please," he begged, his voice barely audible. "Don't let them take me back." Mrs. Parker felt her heart drop. Whatever was happening, it was far bigger and far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Mrs. Parker's mind raced as the black car lingered ominously at the curb. She gently guided the boy inside, locking the door behind them. "Stay here," she whispered, grabbing her phone to call the police again. The boy clutched her arm, his face pale with fear. "No, don't. They'll find out I'm here," he pleaded. Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Parker froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a dark suit, his face calm but his eyes cold. "Ma'am, we're looking for a missing child," he said smoothly. "We believe he may have come this way. Please open the door." Mrs. Parker's grip on the phone tightened. Something about the man's demeanor felt wrong, too rehearsed, too calculated. She glanced at the boy, who shook his head vigorously, tears streaming down his face. Trusting her instincts, she ignored the knocking and whispered for the boy to hide. Suddenly, the black car sped off, and moments later, police sirens filled the air. Officers swarmed the street, their presence finally giving Mrs. Parker a sense of safety. One officer knocked on her door, and she quickly let him in, explaining everything. The boy, still terrified, revealed his story. The men in the car were not from any official agency. They were part of a dangerous group, and the shoebox contained evidence that could expose them. As the officers secured the scene, one of them carefully opened the box again. Inside, hidden beneath layers of paper, was a flash drive. It contained files and videos tied to illegal activities, a discovery that could dismantle the group chasing the boy. But as Mrs. Parker breathed a sigh of relief, she noticed the boy staring out the window. "They're gone," she reassured him, but he didn't look comforted. Instead, he pointed to a shadowy figure standing far down the street, watching silently before vanishing into the night. The boy turned to her, his voice trembling. "They'll be back." And in that chilling moment, Mrs. Parker realized the fight was far from over. As dawn broke, the flashing lights of the police cars finally disappeared, leaving the street quiet again. Inside Mrs. Parker's home, the boy sat on the couch, wrapped in a warm blanket she had given him. Though his fear hadn't completely faded, there was a sense of relief in his eyes. The officers had assured them that the evidence in the shoebox would lead to arrests, and they promised the boy protection. Mrs. Parker gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," she said softly. He looked up at her, managing a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Later that day, a social worker arrived to take the boy to a safe house while the investigation continued. Though it broke her heart to see him go, Mrs. Parker knew he was in good hands. As the car drove away, she stood on her porch, the morning sun casting a warm glow over her small yard. For the first time since it all began, she felt a sense of peace. Life slowly returned to normal, but Mrs. Parker couldn't help but keep an extra watchful eye on her neighborhood. She'd learned that even in the quietest corners, extraordinary things can happen. And sometimes doing the right thing means stepping into the unknown.